The knocking didn't start when the storm arrived. It started when the last shovel of dirt hit the grave. They said grief makes sounds when you're alone. They said guilt echoes when the world goes quiet. But grief doesn't knock in patterns, and guilt doesn't wait outside your door, counting. Somewhere in the dark, something is knocking, and it knows exactly what you did to survive.
Chapter 1.
The farmhouse stood alone where the road stopped pretending it went anywhere. Snow buried the fence posts, softened the sharp edges of the fields, and erased the last signs that other people had ever lived nearby. From a distance, the house looked peaceful, almost gentle, its windows glowing faintly against the white expanse. Up close, it felt like something else entirely, a structure that had learned how to wait. Inside, the air smelled of cold wood, damp wool, and the faint metallic tang of the shovel still leaning against the wall. He hadn't cleaned it yet. He told himself it was because the ground outside was frozen solid, that he might need it again. That was the lie he preferred. The truth sat heavier. The farmhouse was quiet in the way only deep isolation can be. No traffic, no animals, no wind strong enough to howl, just the low creak of old beams adjusting to the cold, and the distant ticking of a clock that no longer kept the right time. He moved slowly through the kitchen, careful not to look at the extra chair still pulled away from the table, careful not to count the plates stacked in the cupboard. 3 plates. Always 3. He hadn't put them there by accident, but he hadn't moved them either. Outside, the storm had already begun to gather, clouds folding over themselves like dirty blankets. The radio had warned him earlier: whiteout conditions, impassable roads, days without clearing. He turned it off halfway through the broadcast. He didn't need to hear how trapped he already was. The burials were fresh, not marked by stones, not blessed by prayers, just mounds of earth pressed down with shaking hands, hidden behind the tree line where the ground dipped and the snow would cover everything by morning. He hadn't cried while he worked. That came later. Or maybe it hadn't come at all. People liked to say survival was instinct, that when things went wrong, the body took over and morality fell away. They said that to make it sound cleaner, forgivable. He knew better. Survival, he'd learned, was a series of choices you never stopped replaying, and some of those choices didn't stay buried. He latched the door as night settled in, sliding the old iron bolt into place. The sound echoed through the house, louder than it should have been. Final. He rested his forehead against the wood for a moment, breathing in the smell of old varnish and cold air seeping through the cracks. That was when he heard it. 3 knocks. Not loud, not desperate, just firm enough to be intentional. He froze, his breath caught halfway in his chest. The clock stopped ticking, or maybe he just stopped hearing it. He waited. Nothing followed. No voice, no footsteps crunching in the snow, just silence pressing in from all sides. "It's nothing," he said aloud, testing his voice, reminding himself he still existed. The house, the wind. But the wind wasn't blowing. He opened the door a crack, peering into the darkness. The porch was empty. Snow lay untouched, smooth as a blank page. No tracks, no shadows moving where they shouldn't. He closed the door, slower this time, and locked it again. The knocking started after the burials. He would repeat that to himself later, like a diagnosis, like a line in a report explaining cause and effect. At the time, it was just a thought that felt heavier than the rest. He moved through the house, checking windows, fingers brushing frost from the glass. Everything was sealed, everything as it should be. That was the problem. The farmhouse had been his refuge once, a place far enough from town that the world's noise couldn't reach him. Now it felt like a container, something designed to hold what was inside until it finished settling. Hours passed, though outside the night stayed the same. He sat by the fire, staring into flames that refused to give him warmth. Every pop of burning wood made his shoulders tense. Every shift of the house sounded deliberate, as if it were listening too. When the second knock came, he didn't jump. This time it was closer together, faster. 3 again. Always 3. He didn't answer. He didn't move. He stared at the door, noticing details he'd never cared about before. The scratches near the handle, the faint discoloration where hands had pushed it open for decades. For a moment he had the unsettling thought that the door looked tired, like it had been opened too many times for the wrong reasons. The knocking stopped. Relief washed over him, thin and temporary. His heart slowed, just enough for the dread to slip in behind it. Because relief didn't mean safety. It meant waiting. He tried to sleep in the armchair, blanket pulled tight, eyes fixed on the hallway that led to the bedrooms he no longer entered. The darkness there felt thicker, heavier, as if it hadn't noticed him yet, but would. Just before sleep took him, just before the house seemed to exhale, he heard it again. Not from the door, from somewhere deeper inside the walls. A dull, hollow sound. Patient. Familiar. The farmhouse settled around him, snow piling higher outside, burying the paths that once led away. And as the storm sealed him in, one truth pressed against his thoughts, steady as a pulse. The knocking had begun, and it wasn't finished.
Chapter 2.
They said grief makes noise. Morning arrived without ceremony. No sunrise, just a thinning of darkness, the world shifting from black to a dull, oppressive gray. Snow pressed against the windows like a held breath. The farmhouse looked smaller in daylight, as if the night had been exaggerating it. Or maybe the night had been honest. He woke stiff in the armchair, jaw clenched, heart already racing as if it had never slowed. For a moment, there was nothing. No knocking. No sound but the soft hiss of the dying fire and his own breath fogging the cold air. Relief came first. Then suspicion followed close behind. He stood slowly, listening. The house was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like it was waiting to see what he would do with the silence. He moved to the window, scraped frost aside with his sleeve, and peered out. Snow. Endless, untouched snow. No footprints, no signs of anyone having stood on the porch, no evidence that the knocking had ever happened at all. That was when the explanations began. Grief does strange things, they said. It rewires the brain, makes sounds out of silence, shapes memory into monsters when the heart can't accept reality. He had heard it once on the radio, months ago, before everything ended. A late-night program about loss and isolation, about widowers hearing their wives call their names, parents waking to children crying from empty rooms. Auditory hallucinations, the host had called them, perfectly normal under extreme emotional stress. He clung to that phrase now like a life raft. Auditory hallucinations. He repeated it while boiling water for coffee, while washing his face in the sink, flinching at his own reflection, while stepping carefully around the extra pair of boots by the door, the ones he hadn't moved since the storm before the last. The house made noises. Old houses always did. Wood contracted in the cold, pipes shifted, wind slipped through cracks too small to see. He knew this. He had lived here long enough to recognize its usual language. But this felt different. Still, denial was a skill he had practiced well. He forced himself into routine, measuring coffee grounds, counting heartbeats, naming objects in the room as if that might anchor him. The kitchen smelled bitter and stale, coffee barely masking the underlying scent of damp earth that seemed to cling to him no matter how much he scrubbed his hands. He carried the mug to the table and sat, facing the door. Grief doesn't knock like that. The thought arrived uninvited, sharp enough to make his fingers tighten around the cup. He swallowed hard and shook his head, as if physically dislodging it. "You're tired," he said to the empty room. "That's all." Outside, the storm had settled into something quieter but no less dangerous. Snow drifted lazily now, piling higher, erasing the world inch by inch. The road was gone entirely, swallowed without a trace. If help had been coming, it wasn't anymore. Isolation did things to people. That much was documented. Scientists had locked volunteers in soundproof rooms, polar stations, submarines. After days, weeks, months, people reported knocks, footsteps, voices. The brain, desperate for pattern, created its own. He told himself he was no different. The first knock of the day came just after noon. 1, 2, 3. Clear, measured, patient. He didn't spill the coffee this time, didn't jump. He simply closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, counting backward the way he'd been taught once, long ago, in a life that felt borrowed now. When he opened his eyes, the knocking had stopped. "See?" his mind whispered. "Nothing. Just stress. Just memory misfiring." He waited a full minute before standing, another before approaching the door. When he opened it, the porch was exactly as it had been all morning. Smooth snow, no tracks, no disturbance. The cold air rushed in, sharp and clean, carrying no scent of another presence. He laughed then, a short, humorless sound that surprised him. "Grief makes noise," he said louder this time, as if lecturing an invisible audience. "Grief lies." The house seemed to listen. The rest of the day passed in fragments. He checked the radio, only static. Tried the phone, dead. He chopped wood with more force than necessary, muscles burning, welcoming the pain because it was simple and honest. By evening, the sky darkened again, heavy with clouds. The farmhouse shrank back into shadow, its corners blurring, its hallways stretching just a little too long. He barricaded the door with a chair. Not because he was afraid, he told himself, just for peace of mind. When the knocking came again, it wasn't at the door. It came from the hallway. 3 dull thuds, muffled, as if struck from the other side of a wall. His heart slowed, then lurched. Grief doesn't knock like that. The phrase repeated itself, louder now, harder to ignore. He stood frozen, staring down the dark corridor where the bedrooms waited, doors closed, secrets intact. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than any sound. He didn't sleep that night, and as the hours stretched thin and the farmhouse breathed around him, one unsettling realization began to take shape, quiet, inevitable, impossible to fully deny. If this was grief, it was learning.
Chapter 3.
The storm made escape impossible. The storm didn't announce itself with thunder. It arrived the way inevitability always does, quietly, then all at once. By morning, the world beyond the farmhouse no longer existed in any meaningful way. Snow pressed against the windows so thickly it muted light itself, turning day into a pale imitation of night. The sky was a single unbroken sheet of white, indistinguishable from the ground below it. Horizon and earth had folded into each other, erasing direction. He tried the door anyway. It opened only a few inches before stopping cold, packed tight with snow. He leaned into it, shoulder burning, boots sliding on the floorboards. The door didn't budge. When he finally stepped back, breath ragged, the cold rushed in as if offended by the attempt. There was nowhere left to run. He said it out loud this time, not as comfort, but as inventory, a fact to be accepted, like the weight of gravity or the certainty of hunger. The power went out shortly after. No dramatic flicker, just the sudden absence of sound. The refrigerator's hum died, the single overhead light cut cleanly to black. For a heartbeat, the house seemed to hold still, as if listening to its own quiet. Then the cold began to matter. He lit the lanterns one by one, their weak yellow glow barely pushing back the shadows. The farmhouse felt larger without electricity, its corners stretching, its hallways deepening. He could smell the oil burning, sharp and acrid, layered over the ever-present scent, damp wood and earth. He checked the radio again. Static, the kind that felt intentional. The phone was no better, no signal, no dial tone, nothing but a dead plastic silence pressed against his ear. He set it down carefully, as though rough handling might offend whatever thin connection still existed between him and the outside world. Food became the next problem. He lined the cans up on the counter, beans, soup, vegetables he'd meant to use weeks ago. He counted them twice, then a third time, slower, hoping the numbers would change if he treated them gently enough. They didn't. He did the math without writing it down, no need to make it official. He'd lived long enough out here to understand rationing, to know how quickly comfort disappeared when heat and calories became variables instead of assumptions. Outside, the wind found its voice. It pushed against the house in long, steady breaths, not howling, not raging, just insisting. Snow scraped along the walls like fingernails. The house answered with creaks and groans, old bones protesting pressure they hadn't felt in years. He moved from room to room, checking seals, stuffing towels into cracks, closing doors to conserve what little warmth remained. Each space felt less like shelter now and more like a compartment, containment. The knocking didn't come all at once. It teased him. A single knock while he was stacking firewood by the hearth, a pause long enough for him to doubt himself. Then two more, perfectly spaced, somewhere near the back of the house. He froze, axe still in hand. "There is nowhere left to run," he whispered, as if the house needed reminding. He followed the sound down the narrow hallway, lantern raised. The beam of light slid over framed photographs he'd turned face down, over wallpaper peeling at the edges, over the closed bedroom doors he refused to open. The hallway ended abruptly at the cracked door to the pantry. The knocking came again, softer this time, from inside. His heart hammered so hard he wondered if that was the sound he'd been hearing all along. He stood there for a full minute, waiting for the panic to crest and break. It didn't. Instead, it settled in, cold, patient. He opened the pantry door. Nothing fell out. No one stood waiting, just shelves of canned goods and dust and the smell of dried herbs that no longer had any scent left in them. The knocking stopped the moment the door opened, like a trick that only worked if you didn't look directly at it. Minor relief crept in despite himself. "See?" his rational part insisted. "Pressure, wood, pipes. You're trapped and your mind is filling in gaps." But even as he closed the door, a deeper certainty took root, quiet, unshakable. The house wasn't making noise. Something was using it. By nightfall, the temperature inside dropped low enough that his breath fogged the air. He fed the fire sparingly, each log a calculated sacrifice. Outside, the storm showed no sign of breaking. Snow climbed higher along the walls, sealing cracks, burying exits. He stood at the window one last time, scraping frost away, searching for any hint of movement, any sign that the world still extended beyond the glass. There was nothing, just white. The knocking returned as he turned away, 3 sharp raps, loud enough this time to vibrate through the floorboards. This time it came from the front door. He didn't answer. He didn't barricade it further. He simply stood there, lantern shaking in his hand, listening as the sound repeated itself, steady, unhurried, certain. The storm had made escape impossible, and as the farmhouse creaked under the weight of snow and silence, the truth settled fully into place. There was nowhere left to run, only whatever was patient enough to wait.
Chapter 4.
Chapter 4. The knocking learned my name. The first time it spoke, he almost missed it. It came between knocks, slipped into the pause like a held breath finally released. Not loud, not clear, just enough to disturb the shape of the silence. He stood in the kitchen, lantern hanging from one hand, the other braced against the counter. The fire had burned low overnight, leaving the house brittle with cold. Frost feathered the inside edges of the windows now, delicate and precise, like the house had grown veins. 3 knocks came from the front door, slow this time, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Then nothing. He waited, counting seconds without realizing he'd started. His heart filled the space the sound left behind, pounding hard enough to make his ears ring. A scratch followed, not frantic, not aggressive, careful, as if whatever was on the other side was learning the surface, mapping it, testing pressure the way fingers test thin ice. His mouth had gone dry. He swallowed and found no relief. "It wasn't asking to come in," he whispered. The phrase felt true the moment he said it, settled into him like a remembered fact. The scratching stopped. He took a step backward, then another. His heel bumped the leg of the table, grounding him just long enough for the rational explanations to try again. Branches blown loose, ice shifting, the house contracting in the cold. But none of those things paused to listen. None of them scratched. The lantern light trembled as he raised it higher. Shadows stretched and folded along the walls, deepening the corners, blurring the edges of doors. The house felt closer now, like it had leaned in without him noticing. 3 knocks again, this time closer together. Tap, tap, tap. A pause. Then, so softly he thought it might be memory, a voice. Not a word, a sound shaped like one. It carried his name the way a question carries weight, without ever fully asking. Familiar in tone, but wrong in texture, as if someone who had heard it many times was trying to reproduce it from memory alone. His chest tightened.
No one alive should have known he was here. He hadn't spoken to anyone since the burials, hadn't used his name out loud. The radio had been dead, the phone useless, the world beyond the storm sealed away. Yet the sound came again, clearer now. His name. He pressed his back against the wall, breath shallow, eyes locked on the door. The scratches returned, tracing short lines into the wood just below the handle, testing height, reach. It wasn't asking to come in, he repeated louder this time, as if the house needed reminding. Or maybe he did. The whisper drifted again, sliding along the edges of sound, never fully forming. Not a demand, not a threat, recognition. Memories surfaced unbidden, standing on this same porch years ago, laughing, keys in hand, calling out to the house as if it were a friend, voices layered over his own, warmer times, before the choices, before survival had demanded its price. The knocking matched the rhythm of those memories now. Tap, 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 pause, scratch. He found himself answering without realizing it, a soft sound escaping his throat, half denial, half plea. The moment it happened, the whisper stopped. The house exhaled. For a few seconds there was nothing, no scratching, no knocking, just the low groan of beams shifting under snow and the faint hiss of the lantern flame. Relief crept in, unwelcome and thin. Then the sound came from somewhere else, behind him. 3 taps against the wall at the end of the hallway, slow, patient, learning. He turned, lantern swinging wildly, light skidding across the peeling wallpaper and the closed bedroom doors. The hallway felt longer than it had before, its end swallowed by shadow. It wasn't asking to come in, he said again, his voice shaking now, because whatever this was, it already knew the layout, already knew where he stood when he listened, already knew how to wait until he responded. The scratching followed, this time higher on the wall, like fingers stretching upward. He backed away until he hit the kitchen doorway, then didn't stop until the counter pressed into his spine. His heart slowed suddenly, unnaturally, like it was trying to make itself smaller. The whisper returned, closer, not from the wall, from the space just beside his ear. He flinched, spinning, lantern raised, but there was nothing there. Just air that felt colder than the rest, just silence that felt crowded. When the knocking finally stopped, it left behind a certainty far worse than fear. This wasn't random. This wasn't grief misfiring or isolation warping sound. Something had learned him. And as he stood alone in the lantern light, surrounded by walls that no longer felt neutral, one thought pressed through the panic, clear and unavoidable. It wasn't asking to come in. It was reminding him it already had.
Chapter 5.
The house began taking sides. By the 4th day of the storm, the farmhouse no longer felt neutral. It had always made sounds, every old building did, but now those sounds carried intention. Floorboards creaked only when he stepped in certain places. Doors resisted his touch, swelling in their frames as if offended by being opened. Even the air felt different, thick and damp, carrying a smell like old paper and buried things. The house remembered what I tried to forget. The thought arrived fully formed, uninvited, and impossible to dismiss. He noticed it first with the bedroom door at the end of the hall, the one he hadn't opened since before the burials. He stood there, lantern raised, staring at the handle. The wood around the frame had warped inward, swelling by cold and moisture. When he tried to turn the knob, it refused to give. He leaned into it, shoulder pressing hard. The door didn't move. Behind him, the floor creaked once, a warning. He turned sharply, heart hammering, but the hallway was empty. The sound hadn't come from beneath his feet. It had come from farther back, near the kitchen, a single groan, low and deliberate, like the house clearing its throat. "Fine," he muttered. "Stay closed." He backed away, the lantern light trembling. The moment he stepped off the warped floorboard, the sound stopped. Coincidence, he told himself, warped wood, old beams shifting under snow. But the house kept doing it. When he walked toward the front door, the floor remained quiet. When he drifted too close to the hallway, the creaks returned, measured, placed, like a language he was only just beginning to understand. The house remembered what I tried to forget. The phrase repeated as he moved through the rooms, testing boundaries like a prisoner mapping a cell. The kitchen stayed warmest, closest to the fire. The living room tolerated him. The hallway watched. The knocking didn't come that morning. That absence felt intentional too. Without it, the house's noises grew louder, more pronounced. The ticking clock resumed on its own, though he hadn't touched it. Pipes knocked in the walls, but never 3 times, never in rhythm, as if something was careful not to imitate itself too closely. By afternoon, the temperature dropped again. He wrapped himself in blankets, fed the fire, rationed food with growing resentment. Hunger sharpened his thoughts, stripped them of softness. That was when the staircase shifted. He had avoided the second floor entirely. There was nothing up there he needed, nothing he wanted. But as he passed beneath it, a soft creak rolled down the steps, one at a time, slow and deliberate. Step. Pause. Step. He froze, staring upward. The lantern light couldn't reach the top. Shadows pooled there, thick and unmoving. No knocking followed, no whisper, just the sound of weight settling where no one stood. "The house remembered what I tried to forget," he whispered, tasting the words. The staircase fell silent. Then he laughed quietly, bitterly. A thin sound scraped from his throat, halfway to a sob. "Of course you do," he said. "You were here." The farmhouse had seen everything, the arguments, the hunger, the choice. It had watched him dig into frozen ground with borrowed strength and shaking hands, watched him look away when it mattered most. Wood remembered pressure, nails remembered force, walls remembered voices long after they stopped echoing. By nightfall, the house had fully chosen its posture. Doors closed on their own, slowly, not slamming, never slamming, just drifting shut, inch by inch, sealing rooms he had just left. When he tried to reopen them, they resisted, hinges squealing in protest. The hallway door closed last. He watched it happen from the kitchen, frozen as the door swung inward and settled into place with a soft, final click. The knocking returned then. Not at the door, from the walls. 3 taps, low and hollow, traveling through the house like a pulse. One from the living room, one from the staircase, one from the hallway, surrounding him. "It wasn't asking to come in," he whispered, the phrase worn thin now, stretched to its breaking point. The house answered with a groan that ran through its frame, long and satisfied. For a moment, just a moment, the sounds stopped. The house stilled, the fire crackled, his breathing slowed. Minor relief crept in, fragile as frost. Then the floor beneath his feet creaked again, sharper this time, directly under his weight. A warning. He stepped back instinctively. The sound ceased. The realization settled heavy in his chest. The house wasn't just remembering. It was cooperating. Whatever knocked, whatever whispered, whatever had learned his name, it wasn't fighting the farmhouse. It was using it.
He backed away from the hallway, staying within the small circle of light the lantern allowed. Around him, the walls loomed closer, the ceiling felt lower, the shadows thicker. The house remembered what he tried to forget, and it was making sure he remembered too. As the lantern flickered and the storm pressed harder against the walls, a new certainty replaced fear, cold, absolute, and far more dangerous. The house had taken sides, and it hadn't chosen him.
Chapter 6.
I realized it wasn't trying to kill me. The realization came quietly, not during a knock, not during a whisper, not even during one of the house's long, deliberate groans. It came in the empty space between sounds, when the farmhouse seemed to hold its breath and let him feel the full weight of being alive. If it wanted him dead, he would already be dead. He sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands, lantern burning low. Sleep had abandoned him entirely now. Not in the dramatic way, no sudden jolts awake, no merciful blackouts, just a slow erosion, minutes stretching into hours, hours folding back on themselves, his thoughts looping, fraying, coming apart at the edges. Punishment is worse when you're allowed to live. The phrase surfaced unbidden, heavy and precise. The knocking had become constant, not loud, not even frequent, but predictable. 3 slow taps every few hours, sometimes from the door, sometimes from the walls, sometimes from the ceiling above the staircase, always just enough to remind him it was still there. Always stopping the moment he acknowledged it. He tested the pattern without meaning to. The last time it knocked, he didn't freeze, didn't whisper, didn't repeat the mantras he'd built like scaffolding around his sanity. He simply sat there, staring into the lantern flame, refusing to react. The knocking continued. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Scratch. His heart raced, his hands trembled, sweat beaded cold along his spine, but the sound didn't stop. It waited, patient, expectant. Finally, hoarsely, he said, "I hear you." The scratching ceased instantly. The silence that followed felt satisfied. That was when the truth settled in. This wasn't an attack. It was a vigil. Whatever shared the farmhouse with him wasn't trying to end his life. It was making sure he stayed awake inside it, making sure there was no silence deep enough, no exhaustion complete enough to let him escape himself. Punishment is worse when you're allowed to live. The phrase reinforced the lesson. The fire refused to burn steadily, sputtering just enough to keep the room cold but not dark. The doors no longer slammed shut, they simply drifted closed behind him, sealing space without trapping him. The floor creaked at irregular intervals, never loud enough to pinpoint, never soft enough to ignore. He began to dread the pauses more than the sounds. Silence had become a test. When nothing happened, his thoughts filled the void, memories he had buried alongside the bodies, the argument, the rationing, the moment he realized there wasn't enough for all of them, the moment he decided not to decide. The farmhouse didn't show him these things. It didn't need to. It only made sure he had time to remember. Hours passed, though outside the night stayed the same. He drifted through the house like a ghost, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of smoke and old sweat. His reflection startled him now, eyes sunken, skin sallow, movements too slow, like he was already half elsewhere. The knocking returned just as his head began to nod. 3 taps, closer than before, from the kitchen wall. He laughed weakly, a sound scraped raw by disuse. "You won't let me sleep," he said, not a question, a fact. The whisper came then, not words, not quite, just breath against the inside of his ear, shaped by familiarity, not threatening, not cruel,
knowing. Punishment is worse when you're allowed to live. He thought of the burials, how quickly the cold had set in, how still everything had been afterward. He'd expected something then, rage, sorrow, release. Instead, he'd felt nothing. Now he felt everything. By dawn, if it could be called that, his hands shook too badly to hold the mug he'd made. Coffee sloshed onto the table, dark and bitter. He didn't bother wiping it up. The house creaked approvingly. He stood unsteady and faced the front door. Snow pressed against it from the outside, a solid wall of white. Escape was no longer even theoretical. "I know," he said, voice barely more than breath. The whisper came again, closer this time, as if in agreement. The realization broke something open inside him. Fear gave way to something worse, understanding. Violence would have been mercy, a scream, a struggle, an ending. Instead, he was being preserved, kept conscious, kept present. Every knock a reminder, every pause an invitation to think, to confess, to suffer. The house remembered what he tried to forget, and now whatever lived in its walls was making sure he never forgot again. As the lantern flickered and the knocking resumed, steady, unhurried, inevitable, he sank back into the chair, eyes open, body shaking, mind trapped in a waking nightmare. Punishment, he realized, was not pain. Punishment was endurance. And as the sound echoed through the farmhouse once more, one final certainty settled over him, heavier than the snow on the roof. This wasn't leading toward death. It was leading to something he could not escape, himself.
Chapter 7.
The knocking stopped. That was worse. The silence arrived without warning. One moment, the farmhouse breathed and whispered and knocked its slow, familiar rhythms into his bones. The next, it stopped, completely, as if someone had reached into the house and turned a dial all the way down. He noticed it because his heart didn't have anything left to compete with. No creaking beams, no ticking clock, no wind scraping snow along the walls. Even the fire had burned itself into a low, sullen glow, its crackle reduced to an occasional uncertain sigh. Silence is never empty. The thought came to him fully formed, heavy with instinct. Humans had always known this. Predators went quiet before they struck. Forests stilled when something unnatural passed through them. Absence wasn't peace, it was pressure. He stood in the kitchen for a long time, lantern hanging uselessly at his side, listening for something, anything to prove the world was still functioning normally. Nothing came. Minutes passed, or hours. Time had grown unreliable again, stretching and folding without permission. Outside, the storm remained unchanged, white pressed against glass, sky and ground fused into a single suffocating mass. Inside, the house felt hollowed out. He took a step. The floor didn't creak. He swallowed. The sound of it felt obscene in the quiet, too loud, too intimate. His breathing followed, ragged and uncontrolled, until he forced it slower, quieter, afraid of what might notice. Silence is never empty. He moved down the hallway, lantern raised, each step deliberate. The wallpaper no longer rustled. The staircase made no complaint as he passed beneath it. Even the doors, once so resistant, hung slack in their frames, offering no protest. The house had withdrawn. That frightened him more than anything that had come before. When the knocking had been there, it had rhythm, intent, a presence he could orient himself around even if he didn't understand it. Now there was nothing to push against, no signal to brace for, just waiting. He opened the pantry door. No sound. He opened the living room door. No sound. He stood at the threshold of the hallway door, the one that led to the bedroom he had avoided since before the burials, and rested his hand on the handle. It didn't resist. The door opened smoothly, silently, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. The air beyond was colder, staler. It carried the faint smell of dust and old fabric, and something deeper, something organic that had been sealed away too long. The lantern light crept forward, illuminating the edges of furniture he'd covered with sheets, the shapes softened like bodies beneath snow. His heart slowed, not in relief, in dread. Silence is never empty. He stepped inside. The room didn't greet him. It didn't react. It simply existed, patient and still. The bed was made, too neatly. The closet door stood ajar, just enough to feel intentional. He stood there, waiting for the knock that never came, waiting for the whisper that refused to return. The absence pressed against him, filling his head with noise, memories replaying unfiltered now that nothing interrupted them. The last argument, the way hunger sharpened voices, the way silence had followed afterward. He squeezed his eyes shut. "Do it, if you're going to." Nothing answered. A weak laugh escaped him, brittle and strained. "You're gone," he said, though the words sounded false even to him. "You finally left." The house remained mute. He backed out of the room slowly, as if retreating from a sleeping animal, and closed the door. It didn't latch. It simply rested in place, barely touching the frame. He returned to the kitchen and sat at the table, hands folded tightly in front of him. His thoughts circled like trapped insects, growing louder the longer the silence held. This was worse. Without the knocking, there was no rhythm to anchor himself to, no cue to anticipate. Each second stretched thin, each one daring him to fill it with his own fear. Silence is never empty. It is a container. And it was filling. The first sound that broke it was his own name. Not whispered, not spoken. Thought. The realization hit him like ice water. The knocking hadn't stopped. It had moved. He felt it then, not in his ears, not in the walls, but inside his chest, a slow, dull pressure matching the rhythm he knew too well. Tap, tap, tap. His heart. He gasped, clutching at his shirt, lantern swinging wildly. The room spun. The sound wasn't external. There was nothing to listen for. There was nowhere to hide from it. The silence returned, deeper now, more complete. And in that quiet, the truth finally settled into him, absolute and suffocating. The knocking hadn't stopped. It no longer needed to. Silence, he understood too late, was never empty. It was a container, and it was filling.
Chapter 8.
I confessed to an empty door. He chose the front door because it felt like a boundary, a line between inside and outside, between what remained of the world and what had been sealed away with him. The snow pressed against it in a solid wall now, packed so tightly it had erased every crack, every gap. No light leaked through, no sound escaped. An empty door. He stood before it with his hands at his sides, shoulders slumped, breath shallow. The lantern sat on the floor behind him, casting his shadow forward, long, distorted, stretching up the wood like something trying to crawl out of him. The house was silent again. Not the expectant silence from before, not the charged stillness that had followed the knocking. This was flatter, resigned, as if everything had already been decided. "It already knew," he whispered.
though he didn't yet know why he was saying it. He swallowed and cleared his throat. The sound felt wrong in the quiet, too personal. He waited for something, anything, to interrupt him. Nothing did, so he began. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, staring at the door handle. His voice sounded thin, brittle, like it might crack if he leaned on it too hard. I thought we could wait it out. I thought the storm would pass." The words came slowly at first, each one dragged free with effort. He hadn't spoken like this since before the burials. Not truth, not unfiltered. The house listened. "There wasn't enough," he continued. "I did the math over and over. I told myself I was being practical, that someone had to be." His hands curled into fists. His nails bit into his palms, grounding him in the sting. They were already weak, already sick. I told myself that meant something, that it made the choice smaller. His reflection stared back at him from the dark glass of the door window, eyes sunken, mouth trembling, a stranger wearing his face. "It already knew," he said again, louder now, as if daring the silence to contradict him. He closed his eyes. The memories surged forward, no longer held at bay by sound or fear. The argument that had gone quiet too fast, the way he'd avoided looking at them afterward, the relief that had followed, brief, shameful, undeniable. "I survived. That's all I did. I survived." The words felt obscene. He waited for the knocking, for the whisper, for the scratch at the door that had become so familiar it felt like punctuation. Nothing came. The door remained closed. He opened his eyes slowly, breath hitching. The silence pressed closer, heavier than before. Confession, it seemed, was not the key he'd hoped it would be. "It already knew," he said again, his voice breaking this time. "You knew before I said it." The house did not respond. The realization cut deeper than fear ever had. This wasn't about revelation. There was no secret left to uncover, no truth that would change the outcome. Whatever was knocking, whatever had learned his name and his guilt and the rhythm of his heart, it hadn't needed this moment. It had only wanted him to reach it himself. His knees gave out. He sank down against the door, back pressed to the cold wood, breath coming in ragged pulls. The door did not open. It did not move. It did not care. The lantern flickered behind him, light dimming, shadows swelling. He laughed then, soft, hollow, edged with something dangerously close to relief. "So that's it. I say it out loud and nothing changes?" The house remained still. It already knew. He sat there for a long time, long enough for his legs to go numb, long enough for the cold to seep through his clothes and into his bones, long enough to understand that confession was not absolution. Outside, the storm continued its slow burial of the world. Inside, the farmhouse held its breath. When he finally stood, unsteady and drained, the silence followed him. It clung to him as he moved away from the door, through the kitchen, down the hallway. The door at the end, the bedroom, stood open now. It hadn't been before. A thin line of darkness waited beyond it, patient and inviting, like the next step in a process that had already begun. He stopped at the threshold, heart pounding, and felt the familiar pressure in his chest return. Not loud, not violent, present. "It already knew," he whispered one last time. And as he stood there staring into the room he had avoided for so long, he understood the final cruelty of it all. The confession
hadn't been for whatever was haunting the house. It had been for him, and it wasn't enough.
Chapter 8.
The door finally opened. The door did not open all at once. It began with a sound so small he almost mistook it for memory, the faint click of a latch releasing pressure it had held for far too long. Not loud, not sudden, just enough to confirm that something had changed. He stood frozen at the end of the hallway, lantern trembling in his grip. The bedroom door, the one he had avoided, the one the house had guarded, had shifted inward by a fraction of an inch. A line of darkness breathed through the gap. The air spilling out was colder than the rest of the house, not just unheated, old. It smelled faintly of dust, fabric, and something beneath that, something organic and sour, like earth disturbed after a long time of rest. Some doors open inward. The phrase surfaced without warning, heavy with meaning. He took a step forward. The floor did not creak. The house, for the first time since the storm began, did not warn him away. That terrified him more than resistance ever had. The lantern light slid into the room inch by inch, revealing shapes without definition. The bed, the dresser, the wardrobe standing slightly ajar, its shadow stretching too long across the floor. Everything looked exactly as he'd left it. Too exactly. No dust disturbed, no signs of time passing. The room had been preserved, sealed away from decay, like something kept waiting for him. Behind him, the farmhouse groaned, not in protest, in acknowledgment. He crossed the threshold. The moment both feet entered the room, the hallway behind him darkened, the lantern light dimming as if the house itself were leaning away. He glanced back once, just long enough to see the kitchen swallowed by shadow, the familiar spaces retreating. Escape had never been closer. The front door lay somewhere beyond the darkness. Buried, yes, but doors could be forced. Snow could be dug through. He still had an axe, still had strength, maybe just enough if he moved now. The knocking returned. Not from the walls, not from the door, from the space just behind his eyes. Tap, tap, tap. His heart stuttered, then matched the rhythm. Some doors open inward. The realization hit him fully then, not as fear, but as clarity. This room wasn't a trap, it was an invitation. The lantern flickered violently, shadows writhing across the walls. In the corner of the room, something shifted, not stepping forward, not retreating, simply adjusting to his presence. The air thickened there, bending light, swallowing detail. He could not see it. That felt intentional. Whatever stood with him did not need form, it needed recognition. The whispers began, not words, not voices, but impressions, weight, expectation, familiarity. He felt memories brushing against his thoughts that were not his own, or perhaps had been shared too deeply to separate. The storm outside howled suddenly, the first real sound it had made in days, as if reminding him the world still existed beyond these walls. He turned toward the darkness behind him, toward escape. His body leaned that way instinctively, muscles tightening, breath quickening. Survival surged up, old and powerful, the same force that had guided his hands before, the same force that made the choice he could never unmake. The knocking intensified, not louder, closer. Judgment was not a voice, it was a pressure,
a presence that did not accuse, did not explain, did not forgive. It simply waited. Some doors open inward. He understood now. Running would not end this. Leaving the house would only carry it with him, embedded deeper, louder without walls to contain it. The knocking would follow, unbounded by distance or storm. This was the only door that mattered. He turned back to the room. The lantern went out. Darkness rushed in, absolute and intimate, pressing against his skin, his thoughts, his breath. He felt the house settle, beams relaxing, tension releasing, like a long-held exhale. For a moment, just a moment, there was peace. Then the knocking stopped. Not because it was finished, but because it was no longer necessary. As the storm raged outside and the farmhouse stood silent at last, one final truth wrapped itself around him, inescapable and complete. Some doors do not lead out, they lead deeper, and once opened, they never truly close.
Chapter 10.
The knocking moved inside. Morning came quietly, not with light, there was very little of that, but with a change in texture. The darkness thinned, becoming less oppressive, like a bruise fading without ever healing. Outside, the storm had finally spent itself. Snow lay heavy and unmoving against the farmhouse, smooth and untouched, as if nothing had ever struggled there at all. Inside, the house was empty. Not abandoned, emptied. The lantern lay cold on the bedroom floor where it had gone out, its glass blackened, its wick drowned. The bed was undisturbed. The wardrobe stood closed now, its door resting flush with the frame as if it had never been ajar. Dust lay evenly across every surface, unbroken by footprints. No signs of fear, no signs of resistance, no signs of him. The farmhouse stood exactly as it had years ago, preserved in quiet, waiting. And yet, tap, tap, tap. The sound did not echo through rooms anymore. It did not travel along walls or vibrate through doors. It had found a smaller space, a warmer one. It came from within his chest. He became aware of it slowly, like a sensation returning to a limb he'd forgotten existed, a pressure beneath the sternum, a rhythm he could not escape because it was his own. His heart beat, and with every beat, the knocking answered. Tap, tap, tap. There was no panic now, no urge to run, no door to choose between. The fear had burned itself down to something quieter and far more enduring. Acceptance. He stood, or thought he stood, in a place that no longer had shape. The farmhouse existed only as memory now, a blueprint etched into him. He could recall every creak, every warped board, every place the house had warned him away from. It didn't need to anymore. The knocking continued as he breathed, as he thought, as he remembered. It did not interrupt him. It did not punish him with sound. It accompanied him. He understood then the final cruelty of it all. The house was never the prison. It was the classroom. The walls narrowed his world until there was nowhere left to look but inward. The doors closed so that the last one, the one inside his own mind, would finally open. Outside, the road reappeared beneath melting snow. Power lines were repaired days later.
A neighbor eventually noticed the drifted-over farmhouse standing too quietly for too long. When they came inside, they found nothing wrong. Food still lined the shelves. The firewood was stacked neatly by the hearth. The beds were made. No sign of struggle. No bodies. No knocking. They said it must have been grief, isolation, a man alone too long with his memories. They said storms did strange things to people, that silence could be dangerous if you let it settle. They said he must have wandered off into the snow. They were wrong. He had never left. The farmhouse still stands, weathered but intact, its windows dark, its doors sealed tight. It does not creak the way it used to. It does not knock. It does not whisper. It doesn't need to, because the sound goes on. In the quiet moments, when the world slows, when guilt sharpens, when survival demands a choice, you can hear it if you listen closely enough. Not outside your door, inside your chest, inside your thoughts. A steady, patient rhythm reminding you that some things do not fade with time. Some things do not stay buried. Some things wait until you are quiet enough to hear them. Tap, tap, tap. The farmhouse is empty. The storm is over. And yet, they never stopped knocking.
The knocking was never about the door. It was about what he buried and what he refused to face. Isolation didn't create the horror. Survival didn't excuse it. Guilt doesn't fade with time. It waits, it listens, and when the world grows quiet enough, it knocks. So before you turn out the lights tonight, ask yourself one thing. If something knocked on your door, would it be asking to come in or reminding you what you locked away? If this story followed you into the dark, subscribe now, because the knocking doesn't end here.